The first thing I remember is the porch light buzzing over the cracked linoleum, and the sound of my mother laughing too loudly to cover the silence that had been living in our house for months. When I say silence, I mean the kind that sits in the corners and takes up chairs and refuses to be moved by dinner conversations or the TV or the dog scratching at the door, because it knows who's not coming back to the table anymore. My name is Hannah Blake, and I grew up in a town so small that the high school marching band and the church bake sale were the same thing, and everyone knew your business before you finished telling it to them. Our street had maples that threw gold leaves everywhere in October, and our mailbox post leaned because Mr. Carter down the block was too busy to fix it, and the grocery store where my mother worked part-time still had that bell above the door that chimed like an apology whenever you went in. My father, Tom Blake, was the kind of man people trusted to check their oil and their thermostat, and to tell you when it was all right to cry and when you needed to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. He fixed the neighbor's lawnmower, volunteered at the Veterans Memorial, and on Sunday mornings he would cut his hair in the kitchen with the radio on low like a man trying to prove that nothing in him had a louder engine than his conscience. There were 3 of us, really 4 if you counted the dog, but the 3 we were uneven in the ways families are uneven. Maya, my older sister, had a laugh that made strangers turn their heads in traffic, and a stubbornness that looked like stubbornness until you saw the soft place beneath it where she kept things that broke her heart in case anyone needed them someday. Jake was 7 years younger than Maya and 12 years younger than me. He had a quiet smile, and a body that never did quite listen to his brain the way other bodies seemed to with my father's voice, especially when it said be careful, don't run, hold on. Jake was born after a quiet winter, a flurry of hospital lights and my mother's hands on his tiny back, saying hello like someone greeting a guest who might leave after supper. The doctors told us early that Jake's muscles wouldn't develop the way other kids did, and that some days he would be more tired than the sun. But we loved him the same way you love coffee or a song that keeps you up at night, because it's still playing on inside you when your eyes close. When Jake was small, my father built him a ramp of plywood and paint so he could get onto our back porch and watch the world of our cul-de-sac fall asleep and wake again. And when the neighborhood kids came by, my father would hold their hands while Jake clapped along and taught the boys how to be gentle whether they wanted to or not. We were ordinary in the ways that felt safe. Girly slumber parties in the living room that ended with us stealing cookies from the tin. High school football games where my father and I froze together on the bleachers. The grocery store runs where my mother would buy an extra pack of chewing gum because she knew Maya would forget her money. And then the lines that held that ordinary together started to fray. It wasn't like a single event erased everything, it was more like a slow leaching out of color, until the photos on the mantle looked like they belonged to people we used to know. My father changed jobs and the new hours came with him like an extra man in the house. He came home later and later, sometimes smelling faintly of someone else's cologne, sometimes carrying a folder he wouldn't open at the kitchen table. I asked him one night at the stove, hands in the dishwater like a woman trying to scrub the shape of the future into something honest, "Is everything okay at work?" And he looked at me for a long time as though counting what he could spare, and then said, "We're fine," and put the plates away with that slow, careful movement like he was stacking lives he wasn't sure he'd be keeping. Maya fell in love when she was 19 with a boy named Ethan who folded himself into the world like he had practiced being humble his whole life. He had hands that smelled like motor oil and a laugh that sounded like he had learned to be happy in the back seat of a pickup truck, which I liked because it reminded me that sometimes the best people are the ones who don't know what they're supposed to be. Ethan worked double shifts at a sheet metal plant and then waited tables on weekends to make rent. And he loved Maya the way some people pray, constantly, without a visible reason sometimes. He loved her with an economy of gestures that were precise and true. My parents did not like Ethan because Ethan couldn't promise them the things they wanted, and my father, who had promised hard work and a certain status to the lines of his kin, asked Maya to think about what the future needed, and said it with a smile that meant you don't have to like the future you did not pay for. Maya told him she didn't care about his money, and my mother cried because she saw the way our street looked at the girl who insisted on giving things away, and because she remembered her own girl self and the ways she had been taught to trade smile for security. After the small-town church ceremony, my aunt brought a casserole to the new couple's tiny apartment above a laundromat, and my father showed up in a suit that didn't fit right and left early. And when he hugged Maya at the door, he said, "You don't have to do this," like there was a secret map he expected her to follow, and she shook her head at him with a look I will never forget. the sweet, stubborn, unglamorous courage of a woman choosing love over ledger. He chose then, I think, to make a line. Not between Maya and us, but between himself and the life he had promised to guard. When Jake was 10, and we were all trying to run from the arguments that leaked through the house like winter drafts, my father met someone. Her name was Laura, and she knew how to order an espresso with the kind of confidence that makes people notice. And she wore high heels on a street that had more gravel than asphalt. And my father told us she was lovely in that way men use the word when they want the world to know they've seen color again. Laura moved into our town, and her apartment had plants everywhere, and a wedding band that had the kind of shine that made my father go quiet for a long time after dinner. My mother, who once told me that love was brave and messy and worth more than currency, started sleeping on the couch with a sweater over her shoulders like a woman trying to hide the shape of her shame, because in our house shame had begun to grow like mold. We watched them, my father and Laura, walk down our main street hand in hand like two people who had decided to be loud and public, and their hands were clean and new and ours were full of reasons to hold on. My father began to say things at the table that felt rehearsed and distant, and one evening after we had eaten, he announced that he had taken a job in another town and that he and Laura were moving because it was better for their future, and that he thought, maybe we would come to visit. There was a sound I had never heard in my father's voice when he said the word move, a small constriction like someone who had been pinched and was trying to breathe through it. My mother left the house that night, and I found her at 3 in the morning on the edge of the river with her sleeves wet to the elbow from the cold. She was holding a paper bag of coffee like it might have instructions inside, and when she saw me she just said, "It's gone, Han," and I knew then that she meant not just the man but the family she'd built her hands around as though it were a fragile thing that could shatter if handled without ceremony. My father left and Jake stayed, and in the simplest of ways everything that was held together by his presence began to sag. The school bus dropped Jake off in the afternoon, and his small body would climb the porch ramp and pause at the threshold like someone trying to listen for the footsteps of a father, who used to appear with a grin and a mint from the drugstore. My thoughts would spin in the kitchen where my mother worked nights, and where I folded laundry on weekends scraping money together for community college, and for Jake's therapy sessions because there are bills that call your name like a bell at midnight, and you answer them out of muscle memory. Inside I was a woman holding a child who needed more than my small paychecks could provide, and a sister whose life choice had painted her as traitor in her father's mind, and a daughter trying to keep the parts of our family that remained from falling into the same hollow the father had finally walked into. Maya's calls to Dad went unanswered for weeks, and then she stopped calling, and when she did call it was at 2 in the morning when the world had fewer witnesses and her voice would falter and say, "I thought he would be better," and I would tell her, "He's not your measure," and wonder if that was true. One winter afternoon my father came back for a weekend to pick up a box of things, and he stood in the hallway like a man who had walked into the wrong house by mistake. He looked at Jake and Jake smiled because he didn't know the hurt had a name, and because children are merciful in that they don't keep score. My father set a box of his things down and told my mother he was sorry, and that he would see us soon, and then he left, and we closed the door with the sound of a hinge that had been rusting for years and a silence that said what everyone was too tired to tell. The twist, the betrayal that consigned our family to the kind of map that shows only the routes someone took away from you, didn't reveal itself in one night. It built like pressure beneath a hill, and then it cracked. 3 years later, my mother found a letter that wasn't addressed to her, and it was tucked behind a photo of the 3 of us at the lake. The way wives used to hide keepsakes in unimportant places and find their way back to them as if to prove the world hadn't totally rearranged itself without consent. In the letter my father had written to Laura a confession of sorts that started off with weather and small talk, and ended with the kind of choice you don't make without imagining the shape of every hearth you are burning. He wrote, "I can't do this anymore," meaning the family, meaning the obligations and the sleepless nights and the slow drain of giving up parts of yourself to stay. He wrote that he loved Laura, and that he had tried to be a husband and a father, and sometimes he had failed with a quietness that makes you feel like you're reading someone else's handwriting, because no one who abandoned you writes the truth without practice. Reading that letter was like running a finger along a jigsaw where the piece had never fit, and where the edges had been forced to match anyway. Maya called my mother a few hours later, and in the line between them she said what a marriage can sometimes say when the truth is naked and not polite. He picked someone with newer shoes over Jake. It was a sentence that landed not with accusation alone, but with the hollowed ache of a child being less desirable than what was new and shiny. Here is where the story becomes something everyone you talk to will look away from, because the kind of cruelty that seems small at first looks like a tsunami when it hits. My father went to court and set a plan for support that he paid for with one hand, and with the other took his weekends, and a life that didn't have the weight of a child who depended on him. He left the weekends and the Christmas mornings and the bedtime prayers, and the middle-of-the-night seizures to my mother and me and to a neighbor named Mrs. Alden who gave rides to Jake sometimes. When we couldn't because she had taught Sunday school for 30 years, and because her husband had left her without warning one summer, and she had a soft spot for abandoned things. Maya decided then to stop speaking to him publicly, and she moved twice in a year, and each time her hands were full of boxes she could not afford to lose. "Your father chose his quiet," she said to me once, eyes rimmed with red and fierce. "He chose not to be uncomfortable with what can't be fixed with a briefcase." And she married Ethan in a little parsonage behind the church the next November. The smell of a turkey in the oven and friends at the kitchen table, and a handful of people who believed that love could be enough to start with. My father was there in the pew, but he sat at the back with Laura and his new son who had been born while we were figuring out how to pay for Jake's physiotherapy. And when we left the church he shook my hand like a man who owed you something, and had nothing left to pay with. Betrayal, you learn, comes in different sizes and is judged by the people who feel it most closely. The hardest secret revealed itself not as a confrontation, but as a small, terrible arithmetic of choices. My father had taken out a second mortgage the year before without telling us to pay for a house they now shared, and my mother found the papers in a folder labeled receipts and odds, and ends in the bottom drawer of the kitchen. Creditors' letters like tiny storms that curl a person's toes under, because once the house is at risk even the bones in your floorboards seem to tremble. She sat on the kitchen floor and cried in that raw, exhausted way people cry when their bodies begin to keep the score of years of small betrayals and small triumphs, and the ledger of human energy begins to tilt toward being unpayable. Jake's doctors said we should consider a transfer to a specialized program in a neighboring city that might help him walk better. But that would cost money and require travel and forms and a proof of fatherly support that looked real on paper. And my father's signature wasn't there because a man who wasn't living with his son didn't have to be the one to sign. I remember my mother holding Jake's little hand and saying, "We will go together," like a person making a promise made of breath and faith. And I remember thinking then that promises made when the rest of the world has walked away have a sharpness that cuts both ways. The emotional breakdown didn't happen in a movie moment where someone shouts and the truth comes clean, and everyone learns and changes and the music swells. It happened at 3 in the morning when Jake had a fever, and the house smelled of antiseptic and used tissues. And my mother rocked his small body and whispered things into his hair that belonged to mothers and to prayer, and to the people who refused to let go. She cried and told me, "I trusted the foundation of this house to be our family. And I thought maybe we all had in some childish way, and that the foundation was never a person but a shared agreement to show up." There were nights when Maya would come over with Ethan, and he would stand by the door like a man who had walked into his life the wrong way, and she would tell him quietly about the time our father's truck broke down, and how he had wept quietly in the garage, because he realized he was losing so much, and that he didn't know how to get it back. Ethan would hold her and say, "We have something here," like a man naming a small country and wanting to defend it. He wasn't rich and he couldn't promise health care or new ramps or the right kind of school, but he promised to learn, and he showed it in the way he put Jake on his shoulders in the backyard and walked with him like a boy teaching a brother how to stand up when the world tried to push him down. Time, which is a blunt instrument and a tender one at the same time, kept moving us forward in small increments. Maya had a baby 3 years into their marriage, and they named her June because it was the month they'd moved to a small duplex, and because baby June's giggle sounded like a weather change that might be permanent. June's life brought a new softness into our house. Children have a talent for forcing small mercy upon stubborn hearts, and she would sit cross-legged and poke Jake's hand through the bars of his adaptive stroller and giggle, and his face would lighten like a sun through fog. Maya and Ethan scraped together money for a used van and painted it. And when the city program called and said there was a spot available for Jake's specialized therapy, the van's paint had chipped, and the seats smelled of packets of sweetener. But we drove across the state anyway with a cooler and sandwiches, and the sense that sometimes people build rescue out of small things. It was in that therapy center that something else happened. My father, by chance, had to be there for a training for a new position he'd taken, and he saw Jake walk in a room of light and equipment that looked like it belonged to a science fiction set, and he stood at the back like a man who had been given a map he did not understand how to read. He watched Jake work with a therapist who coached him on his breathing and on the way to set his feet, and in a small victory that no one else would have seen except the people who had the patience to see, Jake took a step that protested its own existence like a man who had been told walking was impossible, and wanted to try anyway. My father's mouth opened and closed, and he left the building without speaking to us. This is the moment most stories make into a reunion, and perhaps my father hoped for one in the theater of his mind, but in the small town we live in the stakes of pride are often disguised as practicalities, and when he came home he mailed us a check and wrote a letter that began, "I am trying," and it read like an apology written in a language that felt foreign to him. A different kind of betrayal revealed itself when my mother opened his mail, and found that he'd quietly been paying for a set of private lessons for the newborn son he had with Laura, music classes, soccer lessons, a savings account with a name on it, and my mother knew then that the man who left us had not only traded his place at our table for someone else's praise, but had also compartmentalized his affections into accounts with neat balances and small notes. When I say the family fractured, I mean it in the simplest of ways. Our holidays looked different. Our birthday cards had different signatures, and a younger sibling who was not our brother got a front seat at our father's life, and our brother was left to take the back roads to school where the bus driver knew all his scars by name. The healing was not sudden because people do not heal like plaster you slather on a crack and call the job done. Healing came first as small, stuttering things that looked like survival, and was often confused with it. It came as neighbors who saw us struggle and offered a casserole, a ride, a listening ear. It came as a teacher at Jake's school who would stay late to help him with homework and teach him ways to read the room for friends who would not exclude him because of the way his body worked. Maya and Ethan taught us something about the stubbornness of love, how you can look broke and still be wealthy in the currency of care. They became our family, not the family we thought we deserved but the one we needed. Maya learned how to negotiate with insurance companies, and I learned how to make meals from what was left in the pantry, and my mother took a night job at the pharmacy, and her hands grew rough but steady and the ache in her voice thinned into a kind of steadying firmness. There was a time in the middle of that slow repair when my father knocked on the door in the rain, and my mother opened it, and he said, "I'm sorry," in a voice like someone trying to breathe through a storm. And she shut the door. That shut was a small, righteous thing. Not vindictive but necessary, and I wonder sometimes whether shutting doors creates a horizon where a person can be seen properly, or whether it is a wall that keeps out something that might have been mended. Years passed and Jake learned to navigate the world with something like grace, which is to say he learned to accept help and to take small victories as big ones. And the town we were in saw him as Jake who loved frogs and peanut butter, and who could kick a soccer ball with a peculiar, brave accuracy. My father's life, on the other hand, carried the glitter and the newness of whatever he had chosen. He got promotions and small recognitions, and Laura made him laugh, and his new son, who had never known what it was to have a sister or a disabled cousin, got lessons in piano and baseball, and a different kind of attention. But the heart is sly and asks questions in public and private, and my father, in his chair that faced a television that played things he had grown to enjoy without us, began to have other kinds of losses. Losses that did not show up in Instagram photos of family barbecues. He would call sometimes, at first, with a hesitance like a man who had to check what was allowed and what wasn't, and then, less and less, until the calls were like commas between sentences we could not finish. Maya and Ethan moved out of town to raise their children in a city that had more diversity and a neighborhood where kindness was less suspicious. They sent postcards and sometimes came back in summer with hands full of herbs from their garden and new recipes for frugal dinners, and a laughter that always included Jake, who loved to be spun around the living room like a small planet. The unexpected twist came not as reconciliation but as understanding. My father had, in the end, not chosen new shoes over his son, as Maya had said earlier in the kitchen in a sentence that made me want to stop the world. He had chosen the easier temperature for his skin. He had chosen a life where his anxieties could be soothed with convenience, and where the presence of a small, able child meant less practical labor and more social ease. And that is its own kind of heartbreak, because it is not made of malice but of fatigue turned into convenience. And that is a betrayal you cannot always point to because it looks like a person learning to manage their pain rather than face it. There is a scene I remember, my mother and I and Jake on a warm spring day beneath the maples, and he had a scraped knee because he had insisted on running faster than his legs perhaps meant to run, and he looked up and said, "Do you think Dad misses me?" And my mouth tasted of a lie I almost told, because the answer was complicated and the easiest lie is to say, "Yes, of course." Instead I told him, "I think he thinks about you and then he makes choices that are his to make," and Jake, who always listened like a grown man at a funeral, nodded and said, "Okay," like a person learning to make their own peace with the things they cannot change. The healing for me came from the small rebellions of living, finding work that mattered in a school office where I organized field trips and got to see kids like Jake find their joy in art classes, and in the way parents showed up awkwardly for concerts like soldiers learning to smile. I found a partner, a quiet librarian named Sam, who loved old books and knew the difference between listening and fixing, and who would sit with my mother on nights when she needed someone to hold the lamp while she read, and my mother would tell stories about how she met my father in a supermarket aisle, while Buttercup the dog sat like an audience. Maya's family matured into a life where the poor beginnings gave way to a sort of comfortable dignity built on second-hand furniture and thrift store rugs that had personality, and that smelled of stories. Her children grew with an awareness of what love looks like without a lot of money, and they inherited a stubbornness and resilience like a hand-me-down sweater that's just the right fit. One day, years after the first leaving, my father became ill in a way that made old men small, and made the kind of heartache we had all held up like currency fold in on itself. He had to come back to town because his new life did not include a person who could sit with the reality of a hospital stay, nor the steadying hand of a mother, who had learned not to expect rescue, but to give it anyway. He arrived at our house with Laura beside him, and he looked smaller than the man whose shoes had seemed so shiny, and he asked if they could come inside, and my mother, who had been the mapmaker of our household for decades, said, "Come sit." And it felt like an admission that sometimes people do the right thing for the wrong reasons and sometimes for the right reasons, and that both are messy and human. The weeks in the hospital were full of the ordinary. Family members filed through like seasons. Mrs. Alden brought lemon bars, and because she had been divorced herself and had known the long ache of being left, she sat and held my father's hand like a woman who understood that forgiveness can be an act of survival, and not a moral victory. My father apologized then with a clarity that had been missing earlier, and he told Jake, who was older now and taller but still small in the ways a man can be to a child, "I am sorry, I left, I made things worse," and Jake, who had scraped knees again from an afternoon outside, looked at him and said, "You did," and the room held this as a truth that didn't need to be dressed in mercy. My father's apology was not a magical undoing of the past. It was a man owning his choices in a way that made them heavier for him and lighter for us only in the sense that they were finally named. He died 2 months later. An event that rippled with the banal cruelty of losing someone who had the audacity to ask for your presence at the end when they had not given their presence at the middle. At the funeral there were people from both lives, and it felt like 2 different maps had collided, and then folded away. Laura cried and so did my mother. Maya did not speak to her father's eulogy, and that silence was a thunderclap in itself. We sat with the complicated fact that men can be both brave and cowardly, both generous and poor in the currency of care, and that those contradictions live in all of us if we look close enough. In the years after my father's death, my mother became quieter in that way that people do when their work becomes the patient labor of repair and not rescue. She and I moved the house into a smaller place, and Mrs. Alden moved across the street, and Jake got a job at the local library shelving books, and laughing with the teenagers like someone who had learned refuge in stories. Maya's family became the measure of a different kind of wealth. Her oldest, June, took up piano and played the exact song my father had once tried to teach himself and failed at because he did not have the patience, and then she would run up the stairs to tell him about a friend, and he would listen like the most interested person in the world, because she had taught him that attention is a kind of currency that can heal things money cannot touch. Here is the ending, which is not the neat Hollywood kind, but it is an ending that settles on the shape of what remains. A life is a set of choices and consequences, and sometimes you get to weave them into something that resembles repair, and sometimes you live with them as facts that teach you where to lay your hands next time you build something. My father chose his new life over his son. He chose a person who fit his need for a different comfort, and in doing so he taught us, by absence and by return, what love asks of people who claim it. My sister was disowned for marrying a poor man, and in that disowning she found a tribe who loved her for her choices and for her courage, and for the messy, beautiful life she built out of little things piled one on another. Jake never walked the way people sometimes imagine when they pray for miracles, but he walked farther than we thought he might, and he walked with dignity and humor, and a stubborn joy that had nothing to do with who showed up and everything to do with who loved him around the clock. At the end, my mother taught me how to forgive without letting someone in to harm you again, how to hold a cradle of memory without expecting the person who left to fill the cup they broke, and how to make a home that could survive being reconfigured. If there is a lesson, the one that sits like a warm coin in the pocket of these years, it is this. A man's choosing a new family over his child does not erase the child's worth, and being disowned for marrying poorer does not mean the marriage was wrong. It means sometimes families value appearances over people, and some people will choose differently, and those choices will make the life you will eventually have. Live so that when you must choose, you choose presence over polish and kindness over convenience. And if you are left by the ones who promised you the moon, take the fragments and build a little lamp for your own table, because light, even the small one you can control, will teach you the shape of your hands again. I learned that love is not a single triumph but 1,000 small returns, and that the strongest families are not the ones who never break, but the ones who learn how to tend the break with steady hands and enough courage to keep coming back to the table even when there are missing chairs. We kept the little ramp my father once built for Jake on the back porch, because sometimes the evidence of kind things is worth keeping even when the hands that made them chose to be gone. If you ever stand under a maple tree in a small town, and you hear the sound of an old dog barking and the laughter of children playing soccer on a patch of uneven grass, know that families are messy and loyal, and that sometimes the people who matter most to you are the ones who cannot be bought with new shoes. Live loud enough so your children will not need to measure you by absences, and kind enough, so even if they must forgive you, they will never have to forget you. One evening in early fall, when the air smelled like cut grass and wood smoke, Jake asked me to take him down to the old river path where Dad used to teach him how to skip stones. He said it casually, the way you ask for a glass of water, but his fingers were tight around the armrest of his chair, and I knew this was not just about stones. We went just before sunset. The sky was soft orange and purple, and the cicadas were starting their loud evening song. I pushed him slowly along the cracked sidewalk, past houses with porch swings and American flags that had been out since the 4th of July. A couple of kids rode their bikes in circles and waved at Jake like he was part of the street's heartbeat, which in a way he was. When we reached the riverbank, I parked his chair near the low wooden rail and sat beside him on the grass. He took a smooth gray stone from his pocket and turned it over in his hand. He said, "Do you think he knew he was hurting me?" I swallowed. I think he knew he was choosing something else. Jake nodded slowly. I used to think it was because I was broken. That sentence cut deeper than anything I had heard in years. I felt my chest tighten like a door closing too fast. "You were never broken," I said. "You were just different in a world that doesn't slow down enough." He stared at the water moving past us like it was carrying secrets downstream. I wish he had slowed down. I reached for his hand. "Me too." He tossed the stone. It skipped once, then twice, then sank. We stayed there a long time, listening to the river and the bugs and the distant sound of a football practice whistle from the high school field. In that quiet, something in Jake loosened, and something in me did too. A few weeks later, Maya called with news that surprised all of us. She said Laura had reached out to her, not about money or paperwork but about guilt. Laura had admitted she never truly understood what my father had left behind, that she had only seen the part of him that wanted peace and not the trail of ache he left in his wake. Maya listened politely but did not offer forgiveness. After the call she said to me, "Understanding is not the same as repair." And she was right. Time moved forward again, as it always does, steady and indifferent. Jake kept working at the library. My mother started volunteering at the community center, teaching other caregivers how to fill out medical forms and talk to insurance companies without losing their voice. She became a quiet hero to people who felt invisible, and in doing so, she stitched her own heart back together. I married Sam in a small ceremony at the park near the river. Jake wheeled himself down the grass aisle with a basket of flower petals balanced on his lap. And when he reached me, he grinned so hard his cheeks hurt. Maya's kids ran barefoot afterward, chasing fireflies while Ethan grilled hot dogs and corn like it was the most important job in the world. As the sun went down that night, my mother leaned close to me and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" "We did more than all right," I said. She squeezed my hand. "We survived and we stayed kind." And I realized then that maybe that was the real victory. Sometimes late at night, I still think about the man my father might have been if he had stayed. But then I look at the life we built without him. At Jake laughing in the next room. At Maya's kids calling my mother Nana. At Sam making tea in the kitchen. And I understand something simple and heavy and true. We were not abandoned into nothing. We were released into becoming. And sometimes, becoming is the bravest thing a family can do. The years after my wedding settled into a quieter rhythm, the kind that does not make headlines but makes homes. Jake started taking the bus to work by himself. The first day he insisted on doing it alone. My mother stood at the window holding the curtain like it was a rope that could pull him back if the world proved too sharp. He turned once at the end of the driveway and waved, his smile bright and nervous. And my mother pressed her hand to the glass like she was blessing him through it. That night he came home with a crumpled paper bag of fries and a grin that made his whole face glow. He said, "I did it. I didn't even get lost." And my mother laughed in that relieved, shaky way that only mothers of fragile sons ever laugh. He started saving his paychecks in an envelope inside his dresser. He told me he wanted to buy his own winter coat, one that didn't make him look like a kid anymore. When he finally brought home a long gray coat with big buttons, he stood in front of the mirror for a long time, touching the collar, like he was meeting a new version of himself. Maya's life kept blooming in ways that would have made our father uncomfortable. Her house was small, but loud with life. Her kids tracked mud across the kitchen floor, and she did not yell. She just handed them towels and said, "We clean up after ourselves." And somehow they did. One afternoon she admitted to me, "Sometimes I think Dad wouldn't recognize us anymore. Not because we changed into something bad, but because we changed into something he didn't choose." And that truth sat between us like a quiet candle. Then came the phone call that shook our fragile peace. It was from a lawyer in another town. My father had left a will. None of us knew what to expect, and none of us wanted to expect anything. But the lawyer's voice was formal and kind in that way professionals learn. And he asked us to come in. We sat in a small beige office that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old paper. My mother held her purse on her lap like armor. Maya crossed her arms. Jake leaned slightly into me. The lawyer cleared his throat and began to read. My father had left the house he shared with Laura to Laura. He had left savings accounts to his younger son. He had left some personal items to friends. Then came our part. He had left my mother a modest sum, barely enough to cover a year of bills. He had left Maya nothing. And to Jake, he had left his old watch and a note. My hands shook as I took the folded paper from the lawyer. I opened it slowly. It said, "I did not know how to be the man you needed. I am sorry for the weight I could not carry. Take this watch. It kept time when I could not." The room went quiet. Jake stared at the watch in his lap, then up at me. His eyes were glassy but calm. He said softly, "I think he was scared." Maya stood up. Her voice did not shake. He chose again. And we walked out into the parking lot under a pale sky, each of us carrying a different piece of the same old wound. That night, Jake asked if he could hang the watch on the wall instead of wearing it. He said, "I don't want to count my life by his time." So we hung it in the hallway. It ticked quietly, marking seconds that now belonged to us. And in that ticking, we learned something new. Healing does not always come with apologies that make everything right. Sometimes healing is learning to live fully even when the ones who should have loved you best never quite did. And in doing so, you become proof that love can grow in imperfect soil. We were no longer waiting to be chosen. We had already chosen each other. Spring arrived slowly that year, with the smell of wet earth and new grass creeping into our small town. Jake began volunteering at the community center, teaching kids with special needs how to paint and build simple wooden projects. Watching him, I realized how much he had grown. not just physically, but in spirit. He laughed easily now, unburdened by the absence of a father who couldn't stay, and he carried a quiet pride that no one could take away. One afternoon as we were painting birdhouses, he looked up at me and said, "I think I understand now. Some people can't give what they should, but we can still take what's good and make it ours." His voice was calm, yet carried the weight of someone who had lived through disappointment and chosen something better. Maya and her family came to visit one weekend. The kids ran through the yard, chasing each other and screaming in the way that makes small houses feel enormous. Maya and I sat on the porch, sipping lemonade. She looked at me, her eyes soft. "You know, Hannah, life didn't turn out the way Dad imagined for any of us, did it?" "No," I said, smiling at the chaos around us. "But maybe that's the point. We get to write our own rules now." That night, after the house had settled into quiet, I found myself reflecting on everything that had happened. The betrayals, the absences, the hard lessons. I thought about my father, and how his choices shaped us not just in pain but in resilience. I thought about my mother, who had carried so much and never stopped building, and about Maya, who had refused to bend for what didn't feel right. Jake came to my room, holding a stack of sketches he had made of the house, our street, and the river where we skipped stones. "Look," he said, "I drew us." I took the sketches and saw how he had captured everything. The crooked mailbox, the maple trees, the small ramp Dad had built, and even the kids playing soccer. "These are beautiful," I told him. "You've made our world your own." He smiled shyly. "I guess I had to." Years passed. The scars of abandonment softened, not vanished, but they became part of our story rather than the center of it. My mother remarried a man she had met at the community center. He was quiet, patient, and never once tried to replace what had been lost. Together, they created a life full of small joys and steady love. Maya and Ethan thrived in their city home. Her children learned the importance of loyalty, courage, and choosing love over convenience. Jake finished high school, then went to college part-time while working at the library, gaining independence and confidence with each passing day. Sometimes we would gather at the river, the place that had witnessed so many of our pivotal moments. The water rushed past as always, carrying memories and loss, yet reminding us that life moves forward, whether we are ready or not. On one of those evenings, I watched Jake skip stones again. He tossed one, it skipped twice, then sank. He laughed, a sound full of triumph. "I did it," he shouted, and I realized that life was no longer about the choices we could not control, but about the moments we could claim for ourselves. And in that laughter, in the warmth of family that had been chosen and nurtured despite betrayal and hardship, I understood the truth. The measure of a family is not in perfection or wealth, nor in the presence of those who fail us. The measure is in resilience, in the courage to love fully, and in the refusal to let absence define the bounds of our hearts. We had learned to heal, to build, and to thrive. And though scars remained, they were proof not of brokenness, but of survival, endurance, and the quiet power of choosing each other again and again. Life had taught us that love is not given by obligation. It is carved out in the quiet work of showing up. And for that, we were richer than we had ever imagined. The house, the ramp, the river, the maple trees, and the laughter. They all stood as witness to a family that had survived absence, betrayal, and hardship, and had emerged not just intact, but stronger, together, and ready to write the rest of their story on their own terms. By the time Jake was in his early 20s, he had transformed from the quiet, cautious boy we'd worried over into a confident young man who carried his history like armor tempered with kindness. He still had the watch his father left him, but it hung on the wall above his desk like a reminder of time passing and choices made, not as a symbol of resentment. Some nights he would glance at it, run his fingers over the cold metal, and smile softly, as though acknowledging the man who had failed him, while silently choosing to live better than that example. Maya's family visited more often now, bringing laughter, food, and warmth into our smaller home. Her children adored Jake, who would patiently show them how to build model airplanes or paint landscapes, teaching them lessons that neither of us had learned from Dad, but that we had discovered along the way. Patience, creativity, and the quiet pride that comes from doing something with your own hands. My mother, now in her late 50s, had grown into a woman of calm authority. She ran the community center with a steady hand, offering guidance to parents and children who were navigating difficulties we had once known intimately. She had become a mentor, a friend, and a mother again in ways that transcended bloodlines. Watching her, I understood that healing wasn't just about personal survival. It was about creating spaces where others could flourish despite adversity. One autumn evening, Jake and I walked to the river once more. The maples had turned fiery red and gold, their leaves crunching underfoot. He stopped at the edge of the water, bent down, and picked up a stone. "Hannah," he said, "I think I finally understand why Dad left. He wasn't brave enough to be what we needed him to be. But that doesn't have to define us. It doesn't have to define my life." I nodded, feeling a swell of pride and relief. "No," I said. "It doesn't. We've built something stronger than what he could give. We've built it together." He skipped the stone. It bounced across the river's surface 4 times before sinking. He laughed, pure and unburdened. And in that laughter, I realized how far we had come, from abandonment and betrayal, through heartbreak, into resilience and self-made joy. Maya called that evening, letting us know they were moving closer. "The kids are too big to wait for summer visits," she said. "We want to be part of the everyday again." My mother and I exchanged a look, and I felt the warm, steady pulse of a family reconnecting on its own terms. Over time, we began family traditions of our own. Sunday dinners, not dictated by obligation, but by love. Birthdays celebrated with laughter and small surprises. Holiday mornings filled with warmth, rather than tension or judgment. And Jake thrived at the center of it all, not as the son abandoned, but as the heart of a family that had chosen to exist on compassion, courage, and devotion. There were days when the ache of the past returned, letters, memories, and anniversaries that reminded us of absence. But we had learned to meet those days with honesty, conversation, and a shared resolve. We no longer needed the father who had walked away to validate our worth. We had each other, and that was enough. Years later, as I watched Jake teaching a neighborhood child to skip stones just like he had learned, I thought about the man who had chosen another life over ours, and I understood fully. The measure of a father, or a family, is not in perfection, but in the choices we make after the betrayals, the courage we summon to love despite absence, and the resilience we pass on to those who come after us. And in that river, with the stones skipping across the water and sunlight glinting off the surface, I saw our story reflected back. A story of loss, of heartbreak, of betrayal, but most importantly, of survival, courage, and the enduring power of love chosen freely. We had built our own family, one defined not by wealth, status, or unearned obligations, but by the conscious daily choice to show up for each other. And in that choice, we found a life richer and more beautiful than any inheritance could have given us. We had learned the hardest truth of all. Sometimes the people who abandon you teach you the value of those who stay. And sometimes staying, truly staying, is the bravest love of all. The years rolled on, quietly but insistently, and life settled into a rhythm that felt steady, almost unshakable. Jake moved into his own small apartment close to the library where he had worked for years, a place he decorated with his paintings, books, and small trinkets that carried memory and meaning. The watch from Dad still hung above his desk, no longer a reminder of absence but a talisman of endurance, of the life he had built despite being left behind. My mother retired from the community center, though she never truly stopped helping others. She took up gardening in our backyard, planting flowers that bloomed in the spring and vegetables that fed our family through the summer. Her hands, rough from years of work, moved gently over soil and seed, and I would often watch her and marvel at her capacity to nurture and rebuild what had been broken, both in the earth and in ourselves. Maya's children were growing fast, curious, and loud, and they adored Jake like an uncle who had no ego, only generosity. During one visit, June, now 7, tugged at Jake's sleeve and asked, "Can you teach me to skip stones like you do?" And he laughed, his voice carrying across the riverbank where the sun glinted off the water in a way that felt almost holy. He taught her with patience, kneeling beside her, holding her small hands steady, showing her the motion until the stone bounded across the river with perfect skips. Watching them, I realized how cycles could turn, not in the way we expect, but in the ways that truly matter. One late autumn evening, Sam and I sat on the porch with my mother, drinking warm cider as the wind rustled the orange and gold leaves on the maples. Jake had gone out with friends from the library, and Maya's family had driven back home after a weekend filled with laughter and shared meals. My mother sipped her cider, eyes thoughtful. "You know," she said quietly, "I used to think life was about what we lost. But now I see it's about what we keep building, even with our hands and hearts empty sometimes." I nodded, feeling the truth of her words settle deep in me. "We kept each other," I said. "And that was enough." She smiled, faint and tired but full of pride. "More than enough, Hannah. More than enough." The healing we had forged over the years was quiet, subtle, but unshakable. There were moments of remembrance, like the anniversaries of Jake's hospital visits or the day my father left for good. But even those moments no longer carried only pain. They reminded us of our strength, of the resilience we had carved from betrayal and absence. Jake's life flourished. He started a program for children with disabilities at the library, teaching them reading, crafts, and confidence. Parents praised him, not for what he had lost, but for what he gave freely: patience, compassion, and the knowledge that being different didn't mean being less. He spoke at school events, sharing his story not with bitterness but with quiet dignity, teaching others that value isn't measured by who shows up, but by the love you cultivate around you. Maya's children carried the lessons of courage and loyalty. They asked questions about the father who had walked away, and Maya answered honestly without bitterness, letting them understand that life is not always fair, but it is always possible to choose right. And then one summer afternoon, Jake came to the porch holding an envelope. It was from Laura. Inside, she had written a short note expressing regret, not for the life she had built with Dad, but for the hurt she had witnessed him cause, for the family she had watched struggle. She had nothing to offer materially, only acknowledgement. Jake read the note silently, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. He looked at me and said, "It doesn't change anything, but maybe it closes a door properly." I realized then that closure doesn't always come from apologies or restitution. Sometimes closure comes from the quiet, deliberate act of choosing your own life over waiting for someone else to redeem theirs. Years later, standing at the riverbank where it all had begun, I watched Jake skip stones again. The sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the water, and the river carried their reflections onward like fragments of memory and hope. I thought about the man who had left, about the sister who had been disowned, about the mother who had refused to let the family break completely, and I understood the ultimate lesson that had been etched into our lives with both cruelty and grace. Life does not owe us fairness. Love is not guaranteed. But what is possible, what is profoundly human, is the courage to keep choosing, keep building, keep showing up for each other even when others have walked away. We were more than what had been taken from us. We were stronger because we had survived, and we were whole because we had created our own family out of resilience, forgiveness, and the deliberate, tireless acts of love that could not be measured by absence. And in that truth, standing beside the river with Jake laughing and tossing stones across the water, I felt a peace that no betrayal could undo and a hope that would carry us, together, for the rest of our days. Seasons continued to pass, each one layering memories over the last, softening the edges of the past without erasing it. Jake began taking longer trips with his friends from the library, weekend hikes in the nearby mountains, short camping trips along the lakeshore. He wanted to experience the world in ways Dad had never provided, to claim independence fully, and we supported him every step. Watching him push his limits, laughing when he tripped over roots or wobbled on rocky paths, I felt pride that no absence could diminish. Maya's children were growing into curious, compassionate kids who understood struggle in small doses. They often came over to visit Jake and me, and the two households had blended naturally over time. On one chilly winter evening, Maya's eldest daughter, June, leaned on the kitchen counter while Jake showed her how to carve a small wooden bird from a block of pine. "I like being here," she said, smiling. "It feels safe." Jake ruffled her hair. "You're always safe here. That's the rule." My mother, now fully retired, spent her days cultivating the backyard, turning it into a sanctuary with flowers, vegetables, and bird feeders that attracted the local wildlife. She had a way of making every small act, a watering can lifted, A row of seedlings straightened. Feel like a quiet, defiant act of love in a world that had tested her faith repeatedly. One evening, the three of us, my mother, Jake, and I, sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees, the light bouncing off the river in a golden shimmer. Jake held a notebook full of sketches and ideas for his library programs. "I want to build a reading garden," he said. "A place where kids can feel like the library is theirs, not just a building." His eyes sparkled with that determined light he always had. I smiled. "You'll make it happen, Jake. You already have." It was in moments like these that I realized how completely our lives had diverged from the shape Dad had intended, yet how fully we had flourished in the world we built for ourselves. The betrayal, the absences, the choices he had made, they had all left scars, but they had also created space for resilience, courage, and real love to take root. Years later, on a warm spring afternoon, Maya called. She was moving back into town, closer to us, after years away. Her family wanted to be part of our everyday life again. When they arrived, the kids barreled into the yard, and Jake greeted them with that gentle patience he had mastered over the years. Watching them play, I realized how rare and precious it was to reclaim what had been lost through absence. That night, sitting on the porch, my mother said softly, "We've done it. We've built something that can survive anything." "Yes," I replied, looking at Jake, at the maple trees, at Maya's family gathered in the warm glow of the porch lights. Something stronger than any one person could destroy. I thought of Dad, of the choices he had made, and I understood finally. His absence had taught us the value of presence. His betrayal had shown us the strength of love that refuses to bend to convenience. And in the end, the family that had chosen each other, that had endured, that had returned again and again to the table. This family was proof that love, when nurtured, could outlast anything. Jake skipped a stone into the river, the sound ringing like laughter through the air, and I realized that the river, the ramp, the house, the maples, all of it, were now ours in a way they had never been before. We had survived, we had healed, and we had loved fully despite everything. And in that moment, I knew the truest life lesson of all. We cannot control who stays or leaves, but we can choose how we love, how we rebuild, and how we keep showing up for each other. That choice is what defines a family. That choice is what defines us. The river flowed on, carrying memories, pain, hope, and laughter, and we flowed with it, whole, strong, and unbroken. Years turned into decades, and the small town we had grown up in began to change in ways both subtle and striking. The high school football field got a new scoreboard, the corner grocery store added a cafe, and some of the old families moved away, replaced by newcomers who didn't know the stories of our streets. Yet through it all, our family remained a constant in that shifting landscape. Jake thrived in his work at the library. By now, he had expanded the programs he started for children with disabilities, creating a full community initiative that drew support from neighbors, teachers, and volunteers. He had learned to navigate the world with patience, empathy, and quiet confidence. The very qualities Dad had failed to nurture, yet ones he cultivated naturally, born from the love that surrounded him instead. Maya's children had grown into teenagers, full of curiosity, boldness, and that stubborn courage they had inherited from her. She and Ethan ran a small business together, a community bakery that became a gathering place for locals. The aroma of fresh bread, cookies, and pies drifted down the streets, pulling in neighbors like moths to a flame. It was a life built from choice, from care, and from the lessons of resilience they had all lived through. My mother, older now but still steady, spent her days tending her garden, taking long walks with her dogs, and volunteering at the community center in a part-time capacity. She had become a kind of anchor for our family, the one whose patience and unwavering love held everything together, the steady presence that had been missing from so many other corners of our lives. One spring morning, Jake came to me with excitement shining in his eyes. "Hannah, guess what?" he said, waving a letter. It was an acceptance letter from a university in the city, offering him a scholarship to study library science and special education. "They want me to expand programs for accessibility," he said, grinning from ear to ear. I hugged him tightly. "You earned this, Jake. Every bit of it." He laughed, a sound that had once been hesitant and quiet, now full and alive. "We all did in our own ways," he said, glancing toward the back porch where my mother tended to her flowers. That evening, we sat on the porch together, watching the sun sink behind the trees, painting the river in shades of gold and crimson. Maya and her family came by later, bringing baked goods and laughter, filling the yard with warmth. The children ran barefoot in the grass, Jake tossing stones in the river, and for the first time in many years, it felt as though all the fractures, all the betrayals, had been stitched into a tapestry of resilience, love and choice. I thought about my father, about the life he had chosen with Laura, and about all the pain his absence had caused. But I realized finally that his decisions did not define us. Our choices did. We had chosen to stay, to build, to nurture, and to love one another fully despite the betrayals. Maya leaned back against the porch railing, smiling at the scene before us. "It's hard to believe," she said softly, "that we survived all that. And look at what we've built." My mother nodded, eyes misty. "We didn't just survive. We grew stronger. And we found a way to love that couldn't be taken from us." Jake skipped another stone across the river, its reflection shimmering in the golden light. "I think I finally understand," he said quietly. "Family isn't about whose blood. It's about who shows up. Every single day." I felt a deep, steady peace settle over me. The kind that comes only after years of heartbreak, struggle, and resilience. The house, the ramp, the river, the maples, they were ours, not because of inheritance, not because of what was given, but because of what we had chosen to build. And in that choice, I realized the ultimate truth. Life will not always be fair. People will leave, betray, and disappoint. But the love you choose to nurture, the family you choose to be present for, and the courage to rebuild after absence, those are the things that endure. We had learned, through heartbreak and betrayal, through absence and regret, that resilience, kindness, and love are stronger than any inheritance, stronger than any father who walks away. And as the sun set over the river, casting long shadows on the yard, I knew that we were not just surviving. We were living, thriving, and loving fully together. Our family, imperfect and tested, had become unbreakable. And that was the life lesson I would carry forever. Choose love, choose presence, choose each other, and you will create a home that even absence cannot destroy. The years moved quietly, each one folding into the next, bringing small triumphs and quiet moments of joy. Jake graduated with honors, the scholarship carrying him to a city university where he studied tirelessly, determined to build programs that could help children with disabilities across the country. He called every week, sharing stories of the students he helped, the programs he created, and the friendships he made. Each call was filled with excitement and purpose, but also with that steady kindness that had always defined him. Maya's family had grown into a hub of warmth and energy in the town. The bakery flourished and the kids, now teenagers, often helped, learning lessons in responsibility, hard work, and the value of community. Watching them, I realized that life could bend toward hope if nurtured with patience and care, even when the past had been so heavy. My mother, older now but still vibrant, had become a fixture in our neighborhood. People came to her not just for advice, but for comfort, guidance, and the quiet wisdom she had earned through decades of struggle. She no longer spoke often about my father, and neither did we, except to remind ourselves that his absence had shaped, but not broken, our lives. One chilly evening, Jake returned home from the city for a visit. He had grown taller, stronger, and yet retained the gentle, patient spirit that had always been his. He carried a box of books and projects he had created for his students, his eyes sparkling with purpose. "I can't wait for you to see this," he said, grinning. We all gathered around the dining table that night, my mother, Jake, Sam, and me. Maya and her family joined us, the kids chattering about their day, their laughter filling the room like sunlight. Jake opened the box and showed us models, lesson plans, and sketches of playgrounds adapted for children with special needs. "This is what I want to do with my life," he said simply, and I felt a swell of pride and relief. He had not only survived, he had thrived. Later, as the children ran outside, Jake and I stepped onto the porch. The river was calm, reflecting the last streaks of orange from the setting sun. "Hannah," he said softly, "I think we've finally built something Dad could never take from us." "Yes," I whispered, watching him skip a stone across the water. "We did. And it's ours entirely." That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat with my mother on the porch swing. The cool breeze carried the scent of pine, and the faint aroma of the bakery from down the street. "We've lived a hard life," she said quietly. "But look at it now." I nodded. "We've taken the pieces that were left behind and made something beautiful." She smiled, her eyes glistening. "Yes. And that is the true measure of a family. Not who gives you everything, but who stays, who chooses, and who loves despite everything." I leaned back, feeling the weight of years settle into a peaceful warmth. We had endured betrayal, abandonment, and heartbreak. We had faced judgment, poverty, and disappointment. But through it all, we had chosen each other. And in that choice, we had discovered the most profound truth. Love is not given by obligation or blood alone. It is given by presence, by courage, and by the deliberate, steady work of showing up for one another every single day. The river flowed quietly beneath the porch, carrying memories, grief, joy, and hope downstream. And as I watched Jake laughing with the children, teaching them patience and care, I understood fully that we had created a family stronger than absence, more resilient than betrayal, and filled with a love that would endure for generations. We were living proof that even in the wake of deep pain, it was possible to build joy, to nurture resilience, and to craft a life defined not by what was lost, but by what was chosen. And that, I realized with absolute clarity, was the most powerful lesson of all. Our story was not one of abandonment or failure, but of courage, of healing, and of love that refuses to be broken. And in that refusal, we had discovered a life more full, more real, and more beautiful than anything we could have inherited. We had chosen each other, and that choice had made us unbreakable. The years continued to flow, steady and unrelenting, each one leaving its mark, yet also carrying a quiet promise of growth. Jake had now settled into a routine that combined his work at the library with his outreach programs for children with disabilities. He often spoke at local schools and community events, sharing his story with honesty but without bitterness, teaching the value of resilience and the power of showing up for others even when life hadn't shown up for you. Maya's family had expanded their bakery into a small community hub. Children and parents alike came not only for the bread and pastries, but for the warmth and safety that radiated from their home. Maya, once scorned for choosing love over wealth, had turned her defiance into strength, creating a life built on her terms, teaching her children that dignity and courage mattered more than comfort or approval. My mother had grown older, her hands lined with the years of care and work she had poured into our family. Yet, she moved with a quiet grace, tending her garden, nurturing her grandchildren, and offering support to anyone who came seeking guidance. The small porch where we had shared so many talks and sunsets had become our haven, a place where the story of our family, the pain, the resilience, the laughter, was preserved and celebrated. One crisp autumn evening, we all gathered at the river. The maples had turned brilliant shades of red and gold, and the children's laughter carried across the water. Jake held a small wooden bird he had carved for each of them, explaining how each one represented resilience, courage, and hope. The kids listened, eyes wide, hanging on every word. "I think this river has seen it all," Jake said softly, tossing a stone that skipped 3 times before sinking. "It's seen our pain, our anger, our mistakes, and now it's seeing us grow." Maya nodded, watching the children chase each other through the grass. "It's strange," she said quietly, "how much life can change when we choose who we want to be, instead of waiting for others to choose for us." My mother smiled, a serene expression that carried decades of endurance and love. "We learned that the hard way," she said. "But we survived, and we built something that no absence or betrayal could destroy." That night, as the stars blanketed the sky, Jake, Maya, and I sat quietly on the porch swing, listening to the river and the wind rustling the leaves. He held the watch his father left him, turning it over in his hands, then placing it carefully on the railing. "I don't hate him," he said, almost to himself. "I just don't need him. Not anymore." And in that moment I understood fully. The deepest wounds do not define us unless we let them. The people who leave, betray, or abandon may shape our early lives, but the families we choose, the love we nurture, and the courage we summon to keep building, that is what shapes our future. The river flowed quietly below, carrying memories, laughter, pain, and hope downstream. And as I watched Jake teaching the children to skip stones, laughing with abandon, I knew that we had done more than survive. We had built a life defined not by the people who left, but by those who stayed, who loved, and who chose to rise above the past. And so, standing there in the soft glow of twilight, surrounded by the family we had forged with our own hands and hearts, I realized the ultimate truth. Love, resilience, and presence are more powerful than betrayal, wealth, or inheritance. They are what endure, what create real family, and what allow us to live fully despite the scars of our past. We were proof that life, no matter how cruel or unfair at times, could still be beautiful when met with courage, compassion, and the unwavering choice to show up for one another. We were unbroken, and we were whole. Years later, I stood at the edge of the river alone for a moment, the sun dipping low and painting the water gold. Jake was laughing with Maya's children, teaching them to skip stones like he had learned so long ago, and my mother and Sam were chatting quietly on the porch. I watched them, the way the light caught their faces, the way laughter bounced off the river, and I felt a deep, unshakable peace settle over me. I thought about my father, the man who had chosen another life over his own children, who had left wounds that took years to heal. I thought about the pain, the betrayal, the nights of worry, the arguments, and the tears, and I realized something I had known in pieces for years, but now I understood fully. His choices did not define us. His absence did not decide our worth. The love, the courage, and the family we had built, that was our legacy, and it was stronger than anything he could have given. Maya's eldest child ran past me, waving a small wooden bird Jake had carved. "Look, look," she shouted. Jake crouched to help her toss it into the river. The bird skipped across the surface 3 times before floating gently downstream, carried by the current. I smiled, realizing how perfectly it mirrored our own journey. Fragile at first, battered by the past, but resilient enough to keep moving forward. My mother came to stand beside me, her hand brushing mine. "We did it, Hannah," she said softly. "We survived. We built something better than we ever could have imagined." "Yes," I whispered, watching Jake and the children. "Something real. Something we chose." And in that moment, I understood the final truth of our story. Family is not about who gives you what, or who should be there, or the blood that ties you together. Family is about presence, loyalty, and the courage to love fully, even when the world has failed you. It is about choosing each other every day, holding tight when it is hardest, and building a life that no absence or betrayal can ever take away. The river flowed endlessly, carrying our laughter, our grief, and our hope downstream. And as the sun disappeared behind the trees, leaving the sky ablaze with pinks and purples, I knew with certainty that we had made it. We had healed, we had loved, and we had built a family stronger than pain, richer than wealth, and brighter than any sorrow. And that, finally, was the life lesson I would carry forever. The people who stay, who love, who choose, you carry them with you always. They are the true inheritance. We were whole. We were free. And we were finally fully home. Your support keeps us telling stories that matter. Subscribe, give a like, and share this video with friends and family who need a little inspiration today.